Welcome back, everyone, and happy 4th of July to all of my listeners who are in the United States. We're doing the best thing we can be doing on the 4th of July, which is studying the literary history of our country. If you don't know, my name is Eric Diamond. I'm going to be your host through today's investigation into American literary history. We're going to be looking at another note sheet, much like the Puritan note sheet that we had. This is the note sheet for our unit on the American Enlightenment. We're going to talk a little bit about the idea of the Enlightenment in general, go over some of the intellectual context, and we'll also go over what I consider to be the equivalent of TULIP for the Enlightenment. Let's see down here, these 7 principles of what make up the enlightened mindset, the sort of philosophical underpinning of the entire movement. Again, much like what we talked about with Puritanism, Puritanism is a paradigm. If you adopt the central belief of the paradigm, which I would say in the case of Puritanism is total depravity, everything else that a Puritan believes, from covenant theology, limited atonement, the organization of society, the ecclesiology, the beliefs about literature and art, so on and so forth, all of that makes sense. All of that is internally coherent and rational once you adopt the presupposition. And I would say, as someone who is somewhat of a presuppositionalist, I think all of our presuppositions are ultimately irrational, but I do believe that once the presuppositions are ingrained, the beliefs that follow from that tend to be internally coherent and rational. And the same is true in the Enlightenment. So what we had in Puritanism was this central belief or dogma of total depravity, that after the fall, all of mankind's actions, all of his thoughts, all of his deeds are going to be sinful and tainted with sin. Even when he's trying to do a good deed, it is still going to be a sin. Well, here in the Enlightenment, we have this new idea, let me highlight this here, of the natural goodness of human beings. That human beings at birth are born innately good, disposed towards good, and if they become evil later, it's the result of external forces acting upon them, because generally speaking, human beings are good. Human beings want to be morally good. Human beings want to be beneficial to society. They are not naturally selfish, evil, sinful, so on and so forth. This is the central dogma of the Enlightenment, and all of these other beliefs and all the stuff that we're going to be talking about in subsequent lectures on the Enlightenment are going to build on this idea of the natural goodness of human beings, which, given that we live in a country that is, 1, founded on Enlightenment principles, and 2, is operating in the post-Enlightenment period, seems very natural to us. I personally don't think this way, but I think your average American and your average person living in the 21st century, if you ask them to look around and say, do you believe that people are inclined more towards evil or inclined more towards good? I think most people believe in the innate goodness of human beings. Even in the way we talk about basic things, like, for example, when an infant is born, we go, oh, so innocent, so pure, and we have this high valorization of childhood, the ages between, let's say, 4 and 9, as being a special time of innocence, of beauty, of this sort of privileged relationship to the universe where everything is sort of good, wonderful, innocent, pure, so on and so forth. That is actually the exact opposite of the view that was held by the medievals and held in the pagan world, whereby actually children were the least civilized beings, and in some sense they were the most sinful. Not that pagans used sinful as a category, but they were the worst. They were the most inclined towards evil. A pagan, or I don't know, St. Augustine would look at a child and say, look, it's constantly screaming to have its needs met. It's greedy, it's acquisitive, it gets angry very, very easy, it can't control its emotions. It has not been civilized yet. It has not been socialized yet. And so for St. Augustine, that's going to be a sign of infants and children's closeness to the fall, that they have not yet fully developed the graces received at baptism, that were born into this life with that stain of original sin sort of intimately present in a way that it will not be when we attain the age of reason, when we start to use reason in cooperation with grace. Whereas for a pagan, it just represents that the social principle has not been fully indoctrinated into the child. For example, you could look at a Roman writer like Virgil. Virgil in, I believe is this in the Eclogues or the Georgics? No, it's in the Georgics. You see, he has this last, 4th and final section of the Georgics where he talks about bees as being this sort of ideal model of what we want to be as human beings, no pun intended. And the idea is, look, bees live in colonies, everybody does their job properly, they don't have sort of emotional needs, they're not trying to get one over on the other bees, they just function cohesively in this beautiful, organized way that we as Romans and we as human beings more generally should aspire to do. And that idea is, like, children can't do that. Children can't engage in sort of these organized civilizational, societal activities precisely because they're egoistic. And so in the classical and Christian world, this idea of innate goodness of human beings does not exist. But in the Enlightenment, we see a powerful movement in that direction. And you may be asking, well, what is the historical context for this? Why is this the case? And that is the question we want to deal with in literary history and in intellectual history more generally. Because ideas do not just appear out of the ether. Okay? It's not like people woke up one day and went, oh, wow, I feel like being enlightened today. And they just threw off Puritanism. Now, Puritanism went through a long period of decline, as we talked about, the declension beginning in the 1660s, 1670s, halfway covenant liberalization, introduction of Arminianism, later the influence of Unitarianism, and then later Charles Chauncey, Unitarian Universalism. You have a steady decline in Massachusetts, where by the 1740s, 1750s, 1760s, there really are almost no Puritans left. They don't have a lot of cultural power. The Boston Brahmin, the sort of elite in New England who have power, tend to be very liberal, and they adopt these Enlightenment ideas. And one of the reasons, I think, on a sort of ideological or intellectual level, these figures see themselves as being so inclined to the Enlightenment is precisely because of the heavy legacy of Puritanism. Every movement in literary and intellectual history is two things. It's a reaction against the previous movement, but it's also a borrowing from the previous movement. And those two things do not, they exist without tension. Both of those things are going to happen. So you're going to see in the Enlightenment, the idea of covenant theology and congregationalism gets secularized into a society by covenant, which is essentially the Republic, right? The Republic that is formed in 1776, whereby we have a written constitution, whereby we have certain rights, whereby we arrange the polity on a sort of more congregational, egalitarian basis rather than hierarchically. And so that is a secularization of Puritan beliefs. Similarly, you can see when we have a whole unit on the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, which I think is the central text of the American Enlightenment. Ben Franklin, one of his big ideas is, if you have money, that is a sign of virtue. Why? Well, having money means you're thrifty, you're prudent, you work hard, you take risks, right? Like all the things that make a good business owner, for Ben Franklin, those are virtues. You're honest because people won't want to deal with you if you're dishonest. And so for vice versa, Ben Franklin's going to say, if you're poor, chances are you're not a virtuous person. You're not prudent. You're dishonest. People don't like you. You're not sociable. You're not affable. You're not charismatic. You lack all these sort of virtues. And so for Ben Franklin, he's going to say money is a sign of virtue. So having money doesn't necessarily make you virtuous, but all things being equal, if you're virtuous, you're more likely to be wealthy, and vice versa. If you're wealthy, you're more likely to be virtuous. And this idea is really just a secularization of what we saw earlier in John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill, because in the City Upon a Hill discourse, in that lay sermon, Winthrop essentially says, hey, look, here's the covenant, the contract that we've entered in with God, whereby if we follow all of God's commandments, what is going to happen? We're going to become prosperous. Well, why would God make us prosperous for following his commandments? It's not so that we enjoy the wealth, but it's so that we're a sign of contradiction to the backwards papists, right, the Catholics, and Anglicans back home in old Europe. They're going to look at us and go, wow, they're so prosperous and we're so degenerate and backwards in all of our ways. Maybe they are right. Maybe they do have true biblical Christianity. And so for Winthrop, money becomes, in a certain sense, a sign of election, a sign that the people of God is doing something properly. And that continues, and that is secularized into the period of the Enlightenment. So those are the borrowings from. But the reaction against, and I think you figure this out if you look at the history of the Halfway Covenant, it is a heavy burden to live with the idea that God has rejected certain people from the beginning of time as part of an active decision of his active will. That God has said, you are going to be of the elect, you are going to be of the reprobate. And that's all there is to it. And your whole life becomes dedicated to figuring out whether you're elect or reprobate. This causes an enormous amount of psychological stress. For the first generation of Puritans, it was a source of consolation, as was mentioned in previous lectures. This really meant for them, one, that the persecutions that they were undergoing is actually a sign of their faith. It strengthens their faith. But two, that they also don't have to worry about constantly doing good deeds and becoming scrupulous, that actually God is going to take care of them no matter what. However, their children, who are not living under circumstances of persecution, this becomes a really heavy burden for them. And so Puritanism, I would say in large part, just because it's not a fully fledged out religious structure, kind of dissipates over the next 100 years. Now, there are still people who operate within the Reformed tradition, who operate believing in things like double predestination and so on and so forth, but they're in the overwhelming minority, both within Christianity worldwide and within the religious context of the United States. They were a majority in New England for a period of time, but as I mentioned, under the weight of this tremendous burden of tulip, the successive generations become more and more Arminian and more liberal. And so what you're going to see in intellectual history is when people start at one extreme, they always go to the opposite extreme. They never go to like a healthy midpoint. This is something we're going to talk about over and over and over again. You can see this in people's personal histories, and you can see this in people's, what do you want to say? The history of people's, like more broadly, like in the history of nations. So as a personal example, this one's kind of funny, but people intuitively get it. Imagine you have someone who grows up in a very strict household, very religious. They have all, you have a 9 o'clock curfew. You have to be home at, these given times. Your parents are always watching you. They have very, very high expectations of you. Their rules are very strict. Well, that person goes off to college, and what happens? They're at one extreme, too strict, too many rules, too many regulations. And what do? Do they go to a healthy middle? No. In most cases, they go to the opposite extreme, whereby, drinking, partying, all sorts of crazy behavior, and that goes on for a couple years. And then what happens? Do they find a healthy middle ground? No. Well, those same groups of people tend to go to an opposite extreme, where after they've lived the party lifestyle for a period of time, all of a sudden they're adopting excessively strict mentalities in other ways. So it's like totally normal for someone to live a crazy party life for 4 years, doing all sorts of embarrassing things that they would not want other people to find out about. And then after they graduate and get a job, all of a sudden it's, I have to work out every single day. Not just because I want to be healthy, but it's like a moral obligation. I am now a vegan. I now meditate for 15 minutes morning and night. Now I have all these strict practices that I make myself follow, not out of a sense of self-improvement, but almost a sense of religious obligation. Well, why? It's the same thing. You go from super strict, super liberal, back to super strict. You always have these turnings in history. On a societal level, you see something very similar. For example, Prussia at the end of the 19th century. Extremely strict militaristic society, regimented, focused on rules, so on and so forth. Well, what happens? Prussia collapses after World War I. You get the Weimar Republic, which is total, is it a healthy middle? No, it's total liberalism, total social degeneracy, complete do whatever you feel like, no rules, live for the moment, so on and so forth. And that society collapses, and then do people go back to a healthy middle ground? No, well, we go right back to extreme militarism, ethnic pride, nationalism, so on and so forth with the Third Reich, okay? So this happens over and over again in intellectual history, and you're going to see it in the context of the Enlightenment, because what happens here, we go from tulip, which is people have no free will, people have no free will, people are born to be sinful, they're born vessels of damnation, everything you do is a sin, to actually we have free will, actually we can become perfect, and actually human beings are born tabula rasa. They're blank slates, they're innocent, they're pure until they become corrupted by outside forces. This is the doctrine of the Enlightenment. And so I have a definition here. I'll read it out real quick. This is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a great resource. It's not the perfect definition of the Enlightenment, but I think it's a good start. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Any sort of general philosophical question you have, it can be a bit dense at times, but I think it's a wonderful resource after you've finished reading the Wikipedia article to go to. And in this case, we're going to look at their definition of enlightenment. And it reads as follows. The Enlightenment is the period in the history of Western thought and culture stretching roughly from the mid-decades of the 17th century, that's in the English context, it's not going to hit America until about 100 years later, through the 18th century, characterized by dramatic revolutions in science, philosophy, society, and politics. These revolutions swept away the medieval worldview and ushered in our modern Western world. Enlightenment thought culminates historically in the political upheaval of the French Revolution, in which the traditional hierarchical political and social orders, the French monarchy, the privileges of the French nobility, the political power and authority of the Catholic Church, were violently destroyed and replaced by a political and social order informed by the Enlightenment ideals of freedom and equality for all, founded ostensibly upon principles of human reason. Okay, so that's a lot, and so we're going to break that down. So Enlightenment comes out of the Renaissance. It begins in the European context, really in the 1650s, 1640s, and originates primarily in England, though obviously it's going to spread to the rest of the continent. The first major Enlightenment thinkers that we see in England John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, to a certain extent, has Enlightenment tendencies. And they're going to be developing a lot of early political thought, early liberal thought that is secular, that separates itself from the art of politics seen as being tied to Christian revelation. And in order to fully understand this, you have to understand the idea of the three major epochs in Western history. And these are, you have the classical period or the pagan period, you have the medieval period or the Christian period, and then you have the modern period, which is secular. And so the idea here is you have pagan civilizations. This is Greece, this is Rome. This is the classical world prior to the introduction of Christian revelation. And those societies have a certain set of values that they have inherent to them of a sort of presuppositional religious nature. Following that, you have the introduction of Christianity really taking off in the 5th century with the beginning of the medieval worldview, and the medieval worldview being essentially Christendom. The idea that no, what's actually going to center all of our societal relations, both on a political level and on a personal level, is going to be the Christian revelation, is going to be the Bible, is going to be the Catholic Church, so on and so forth. Well, beginning in the Renaissance period, or what we now call the early modern period, the influence of the Catholic Church begins to wane steadily. The influence of Christianity generally begins to liberalize and wane steadily, eventually culminating in what I would say is the Enlightenment, which is at a period of intense secularization, which is the attempting to found a political order not on the basis of the pagan worldview, nor on the basis of the Christian worldview, but rather on the basis of, at least initially in the Enlightenment, pure reason. And so one of these central ideas of the Enlightenment is we are going to adopt all of our opinions about science, about the human person, and about the political order on the basis of pure reason. And what does that mean? We're going to ignore revelation. So in the medieval context, everything from how marriages were arranged, to how families were arranged, to the political structure, feudalism, all of this was backed on the basis of Christian revelation. It all goes back to the Bible, and then later to church fathers, the tradition, the magisterium, so on and so forth. And the idea is, look, a medieval would say faith is actually a more certain form of knowledge than reason. And so I'll repeat that again. Faith and reason do not contradict each other. A medieval would say, no, they do not contradict each other. But faith is a more certain form of knowledge than reason. So you can see this, for example, in St. John Henry Newman, or Cardinal John Henry Newman, however you prefer to call him. St. John Henry Newman has a quote, I believe it's in the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, where he says, his belief in Jesus Christ is something to him that is more certain than the fact that he has two hands. So John Henry Newman would say, epistemologically, I actually have a higher degree of certainty that Christ died for my sins and that I have experienced conversion, this interior grace of the Holy Spirit, and that I'm going to go to the next life, that Christ is going to come again to judge the living and the dead, all the things that Christian revelation is predicated upon. I am more certain of those than the fact that I have two hands. Well, why? Without faith, reason does not exist, right? So a Christian would say, particularly a medieval Christian, would say, I actually, the idea that the world is intelligible and that I can come to rational conclusions about the world is predicated on there being God, is predicated on there being revelation, is predicated on there being an unmoved mover, a highest good, so on and so forth. Even now, why should I believe that every cause has an effect? I don't actually have any sort of epistemological certainty for it. I may see, okay, well, it seems that every cause has an effect because I've experienced it X number of times, but I don't have 100% certainty on it. Same with you'll see this when we talk about empiricism, particularly later when we get into transcendentalism. Look, the sun rises every day. Do I know the sun is going to rise tomorrow? No, I have a very high degree of probability, but I don't have a priori apodictic certainty the sun is going to rise tomorrow. And so what Christians would say is empirical truths are lower level because they're based on probabilities. And so the idea that I have two hands, that's based on sense perception, that's based on probability. That's based on a world that is actually inferior to the world of revelation, which is based on apodictic certainties, which is based on faith. And the idea is faith is the faculty which is more certain than the senses. Why? Because you can experience sensory delusions. There are all these stories in saints' lives of saints being deluded by demons to try to get them to renounce their faith or commit evil acts. And the true Christian rejects the world of the senses, both through mortifications, right, through fasting, through baths in cold water, self-flagellation, like all the different principles and activities of the ascetic life, but also through just a sort of general denial of the senses, is that if all the sensory evidence tries to convince me that Christ did not die for my sins, I will reject all the sensory evidence in favor of this interior knowledge of the heart, which is not predicated on the senses, which in fact is extrasensory, and for that exact reason, superior. Because think about it, the Christian idea is the soul is higher than the body. Well, the knowledge that pertains to the soul, the knowledge that pertains to things that are immaterial, must therefore be more perfect than knowledge to the things that pertain to bodies, which are material. Okay? In the Enlightenment, that's all going to be thrown out. The Enlightenment thinkers essentially say that's a load of superstition. That's a big word in the Enlightenment, superstition. That's a load of nonsense. We don't really believe in any of those ideas. We're going to toss out this whole idea of revelation, of the Bible being a document that is the Word of God, that is the most certain, what do we want to say, like form of knowledge that we have. And instead, we are actually going to valorize sense perception and a priori rational thinking in terms of like things like syllogisms, so on and so forth, to create a new society, not on the basis of pagan values and pagan revelation, nor on the basis of the Christian revelation, but rather on the basis of what's up here, reason, and our observation of sensory data. And so the Enlightenment historiography changes because for Christians would look at the world and they would say, well, the pagan world was the Dark Ages, and people were living in superstition and barbarism, though they had some elements of the truth. And Rome, Dante actually says this, Rome is the most perfect pagan civilization that could exist. So in other words, if you took pagan principles and you took only the best of them, and there was no Christian revelation, and you produced the best society you could with those principles, it would be Rome. It's the perfect pagan society. And then Rome becomes Christianized. This is the Roman Catholic Church, right, which is headed in Rome. Rome becomes Christianized. The old Rome of the flesh becomes the new Rome of the spirit. And actually, this is super interesting because in Latin, Dante says this as well. Roma is the name of the city, but Roma spelled backwards is what? Amor. So Roma flipped upside down in the Christian revelation. All the pagan values flipped on their head. Instead of valorizing strength, we value meekness, right? Instead of valorizing pride, we valorize humility. Like we flip all the values on their head, and instead of Roma, we get Amor. We get the society of love, charity, Christian brotherhood. Dante's a fascinating figure. If you want a lecture series on Dante, I think that would be awesome. I've taught Dante probably 7 or 8 times now. Love Dante. But what Dante is going to say is what Dante is going to say is that Rome becomes the Christian society, and in the new Rome, we have a perfection of paganism. All the good things in paganism reach their peak, all the bad things of paganism burn off, and we have the reign of the church, which lasts for about a millennia, from about the year 400 roughly to about 1400. And after that, you have the Renaissance, and you have a period of slow decline. So, right, it starts here, it goes up, and then it declines. This is the idea. And then the secularization of the Renaissance, early modern period, and then the Enlightenment, for a Christian, represents a period of decline. Whereas the Enlightenment historiography is totally different. The pagan world of Greece and Rome represent the triumph of reason. And things are going up, things are going up, things are going up. And then, oh no, superstition, Christian revelation. This is where we get the term Dark Ages. That was invented by Enlightenment thinkers to talk about the Middle Ages. Let's call them the Dark Ages as a pejorative to make them look bad, to make them look superstitious, to show that these were irrational periods of time, which I don't agree with. We can get into that in a different time. But that's the Enlightenment view, is that this is the Dark Ages, things go down. And then finally, America or France or whatever enlightened nation is going to pick up the slack, and we're going to continue where Rome left off. So where Greece and Rome left off, we're going to continue, and we're going to build a society on reason. And to this day, most people think that way. Most people think Greece and Rome, okay, there were cool things about it, whatever. And then 1,000 years of history in which nothing happened, no importance whatsoever. It's the Monty Python view of the Middle Ages, right? Everybody's running around with poop on their heads. Nobody has any idea what's going on. There's no science, there's no development, there's no technology, all of which is false, by the way. That's the black legend about the Middle Ages. None of that is true. In fact, the Middle Ages is one of the periods of highest scientific and technological developments that we have in human history. Neither here nor there. Going from that, then we have the Renaissance, things start to get better, and now we have us, the enlightened thinkers, who are using pure reason to do what? Well, to take down these three things: the privileges of the monarchy, the nobility, and the Catholic Church. The three big enemies of all the enlightened thinkers are as follows: the monarchy, the military, and the church. Well, notice what the United States does when it declares its independence in 1776. The society that is established, is it a monarchy? No, it is a republic and is based on Republican principles with clear houses of legislature, judges, and you're going to have a president who does not reign for life but only reigns for 4 years and who is elected by the people rather than elected by God. So the whole idea of the monarch for a medieval Christian is that the monarch is anointed by God, that God actually decides who the kings are going to be. They're anointed in the name of God. They are elected by God to protect Christendom in the Christian realm, and it is not for us to judge their conduct. They may reign well, they may reign poorly. That's a reflection of their piety of the people and the will of God, but we are not to judge the monarch on the basis of rational principles, nor can we say, oh, well, this person would be a better monarch because he's smarter and he's more politically apt. No, God has elected the monarch. You do not judge the ways of God. God is infinitely more intelligent than you and I. God has elected this person to be the monarch. Just shut up about it. Whereas the Enlightenment view is, no, we can actually have a more rationally organized political system if we decide who the best leader is going to be on rational criteria. This is the Republican idea. And so the monarchy becomes this big target, and we build a society which is against King George III, who is one of the major, what do you want to say, punching bags of the patriots and the American Enlightenment thinkers, and we build our society on Republican principles. Then you have the army, and not a lot of people realize this, but like a huge aspect of the founding of the Republic was that there was not going to be a standing army, precisely because the Enlightenment thinkers thought that armies in general, militaries in general, were forces of reaction, forces of conservatism, and forces which supported the church and supported the monarchy. And they would be right. You notice this in any military, is that the people who are inclined to military life in any society tend to be the most religious, tend to be the most conservative, traditional, reactionary, right-wing, whatever you want to call it, and they tend to oppose liberal ideas. And so the Enlightenment thinkers say the military is this degenerate institution, and on top of that, the military is how the aristocracy is supported, because if you do really well in some military campaign, you might become an aristocrat. You might become like made a gentleman, part of the gentry. And from there, you inherit titles that get passed on to your kids, independently of whether or not your children or your children's children did anything of merit. And so for the Enlightenment, the Enlightenment thinkers are like, this is ridiculous. We need to rearrange the military to get rid of the gentry, which is what Napoleon Bonaparte actually does. And that's actually how Napoleon Bonaparte makes his career, is essentially by way of a military which is rationally organized and that says, hey, we're going to have promotions not on the basis of birth, but strictly on the basis of merit, and get rid of the aristocracy. In any case, the point is, the Enlightenment thinkers hated the military. They wanted a society without a standing army. Well, lo and behold, we most certainly have a standing army. That's been pretty much abandoned. But that was the rationale behind no standing army and also the Second Amendment. Now, the other big enemy is the church. And so the idea is the church, and in particular the Roman Catholic Church and the High Church Anglicans, they represent forces of reaction because they preach a worldview which is hierarchical. They preach obedience to the monarch. They preach all these things that, on the basis of revelation, mind you, they preach this on the basis of revelation. They preach all these things that are contrary to pure reason and that go against the Enlightenment, the liberalism. So we have to take down the Catholic Church, the High Church Anglicans, and the forces of reaction. Lower church Protestants, like the Quakers, the Unitarians, they were accepted. They were still viewed as being superstitious and kind of reactionary, but they were more accepted than the Catholics and the High Church Anglicans. And so what you find is you have this powerful objection to superstition, the key Enlightenment word, and the idea that the United States, when it forms this unique nation, is going to be unique in world history, the first secular nation, a nation that does not have a public cult, a nation which accepts religious or tolerance for all religions, and which effectively, in its sort of outward political appearance, is not going to favor one particular religion over the other or base itself on a particular set of religious tenets. And so that idea is there from the very start, because they see Christianity in all of its forms as being somewhat hostile to the forces of enlightenment, to the progress of reason. They see it as being an outgrowth of the Dark Ages. Even when it's relatively liberal Christianity, that's, for example, like Quakerism, anti-slavery, or like Unitarianism, which effectively sees Christ not as God. Even when it's like low church Protestants, where they're not wearing vestments, there's no sacraments, there's no idea of sacrifice. All Enlightenment figures are going to see this as being superstitious in nature. Okay, and what we see is the Enlightenment ideas of freedom, of equality for all, founded on the principles of human reason. And you see this in the French Revolution. You have these ideas of liberté, égalité, et fraternité. Okay, liberty, equality, and freedom. And so the idea is we value a society which allows people to make free decisions to the extent that is possible. Liberty, you want to have freedom to do things. Equality, we want to assure that everyone at bare minimum starts on a level playing field, that there's possibility for social advancement. Social advancement uniquely in the Enlightenment, very uniquely compared to the medieval worldview. Social advancement is seen as a good thing for the first time in world history rather than a bad thing. People moving up and down. Like if you read Dante in the Inferno just over and over and over again attacks merchants and middle-class people for trying to move up in society. Dante thought, like, this is the death of Florence and this is the death of the Christian worldview, these stupid bourgeois middle-class people trying to make money and move up in society. So social mobility was not always seen as a good thing. In any case, so liberty, equality, and then fraternity, this idea that independently of race, ethnicity, religion, if you have Enlightenment worldview ideas and I have Enlightenment worldview ideas, we can get together and we can work things out. We can essentially see each other as brothers in a common set of institutions, put aside our differences, and be tolerant of each other. These are fundamental aspects of the Enlightenment worldview. Now, later, I kind of like this. So what do the people who objected to the Enlightenment believe in? The sort of reactionaries who sided more with the High Church Anglicans and the Catholics, which, by the way, in the American context, hopefully you know this, in New England, it's mostly low church. It's mostly Congregationalists and Presbyterians. But in the South, Virginia moving southward, it's High Church Anglicans and Catholics. We always think of the South as being anti-Catholic because of what happened with the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan at the beginning of the 20th century. But that's really a post-Civil War thing. Up through this period of the Civil War, the South is intensely Catholic. Like, for example, the guy, Father Abram Ryan, who was considered the poet laureate of the Confederacy, he was a Roman Catholic priest, right? There were tons of Catholics in the South. Not a lot of people know this. Jefferson Davis actually almost converted to Catholicism as a young man. He was so enchanted by it. But there were tons of Catholics in the South. And what do you notice during the period of the Revolutionary War, really the Civil War that established the American nation, all the people who were on the side of the patriots, the separatists, they were in the North. And lo and behold, all the people who were the loyalists, right, the people who sided with the monarchy, they were in the South. And so these sort of confessional differences, these ideological differences and philosophical differences, they map onto each other geographically as well. And so there's a lot of, what do you want to say, consistency across these lines. In any case, what are these reactionaries, the people who supported the monarchy, whether in the American Revolution, French Revolution, like in the Vendée, what did they believe in? I actually like the way that a Spanish philosopher by the name of Ramiro de Maeztu talks about this concept. He says, essentially, there's an opposite to the French Revolutionary idea of liberté, égalité, fraternité. And he says it's duty, hierarchy, and humanity. So instead of the idea of liberty, we have the idea of duties. Everyone, you should not have freedom. You should instead follow the set of duties and obligations that are concurrent or concomitant with your state in life. So if I'm born a peasant, I should try to be the best peasant I can and serve my Lord and serve God. If I'm born a lord, I should try to be the best lord I can, fulfill all my obligations to my peasants, make sure that they're well housed, that they're well fed, that they're protected, that they're taken care of. But everybody should strive to follow their duty. So instead of asking for rights and saying, I'm born with rights, it's an opposite way of thinking about it, where, no, I'm actually not born with rights, I'm born with obligations. And so it accomplishes sort of the same effect, but in reverse. Instead of equality, rigid hierarchy, you have God at the top, the Pope, the monarchs, right, going all the way down, and everybody is part of this divine chain of command in which there is clear hierarchy and there is clear rank. And then finally, instead of fraternity, humanity. So instead of seeing ourselves as universal brothers, as long as we hold to the same ideology, we should strive not to just favor people on the basis of an ideological basis, but to treat all people humanly and with the degree of respect that is accorded to the particular state in life. So you treat a stranger like a stranger, but you treat them humanly, you treat them warmly, you treat them well, but you're obviously going to treat someone who's closer to you, like your wife or children, differently. And the idea is to maximize the humanity of all existing social institutions, whether that's maximizing the humanity of the family, maximizing the humanity of the church, maximizing the humanity of the guilds. The idea from Miro de Maestro is not to establish a sort of universal principle of brotherhood on the basis of this shared ideological presupposition, but rather to just engage in all of our interactions in a way that is human and warm, which in the age of AI and ChatGPT does not sound that bad. Good. If you have questions, please put them down in the comments. There's still a lot to go through. We'll start to go through some of this now. Not ready to finish just yet. But I know it is confusing. I go through things kind of fast. So if you have questions, I love when I get questions or comments. That's the one thing I miss the most about teaching this in a classroom, is there's always a good back and forth, people arguing, so on and so forth. That's fun. Put that down in the comments for me. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention, you also may want to take a look at the description. There are 2 interesting products that may appeal to you. One is a program called the College Degree Accelerator to help you graduate college in 2 years or less. Yes, which is possible. I've done it myself. I've got this whole program outlined with sort of a rubric for how to do well on 11 different AP exams, how to self-study them, how to study efficiently as possible. In some cases, as little as 4 hours of study will save you a couple $1,000s with some AP credits you can earn. You can go take a look at that. They also have another program called the Scholar's Path, which is dedicated to what do you need to do in order to become an intellectual? What are the habits? How do you approach film? How do you approach music? How do you approach all these different problems in the intellectual life? That's a full course, and you can go take a look at that in the description. Good. Okay, in any case, let's get back at it. So we looked at the definition from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Now we're going to look at Kant and Jefferson's definition of enlightenment. So Immanuel Kant, you should know, he's one of those figures that kind of straddles the Enlightenment and Romanticism. There are aspects of his thought that I think are very romantic, that are very proto-transcendentalist. There are aspects of his thought that are very much indebted to the Enlightenment. I'm not going to get too much into Kant now. We'll talk a lot about Immanuel Kant when we get to Transcendentalism. But he writes a famous essay in answer to the question, what is enlightenment, 1784, and which he says, Kant is going to say, enlightenment is humankind's release from its self-incurred immaturity. What is immaturity? Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. So here the idea is, for Kant, the Christian worldview and the pagan worldview were immature. Human being is going through Human beings in history are going through a collective process of maturation and improvement. So this is the idea of Whig historiography, which is also central to the Enlightenment. That things just get better and better and better as time progresses. That instead of like the Christian worldview, which is basically things may get better for a little bit, but they're eventually going to get worse, and the second coming is going to happen. The pagan worldview, which is just eternal cycles of things get good, things get bad, things get good, things get bad. Kant is going to say, no, things just get better. We're maturing as human beings. Well, what was our immaturity? Well, that was the pagan and Christian systems where we had to rely on other documents or worldviews or paradigms to do the thinking for us. So we just sort of believed things on the basis of this was what was handed down by our ancestors, or on the basis of revelation. So for the pagans, it's very focused on the family. This is what the family has always done. These are the sacred traditions, whatever. In the Christian worldview, based on revelation, this is what the church has revealed. This is what the church has taught. And Kant says in the Enlightenment, we are finally now evaluating things. We're standing on our own 2 feet, and we're sort of looking at all things through the lens of reason. And Jefferson is going to say something similar, though his definition is a bit more political. So what does Thomas Jefferson say about enlightenment? All eyes are now open to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open the view of every palpable truth, that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. There are grounds of hope for others. So again, what do you notice here? This intense valorization of what? An intense valorization of social mobility. So Jefferson's going to say, in the old system, the ancien regime, right? The old regime. My French is terrible, by the way, so forgive the way I pronounce that. But in the old regime, meaning Christendom, Jefferson is going to say, you have certain people who are the riders who get on top of the horse, and then you have certain people who are the horse or the donkey. And who's doing the riding? The church the nobility or the military, and the monarchy. And everyone else, the middle class and also the peasants, they're the ones who have to sort of support the weight of these degenerates who often do not work that hard and who say essentially, God has given me the right to rule over you. Okay, given the ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. And he says enlightenment essentially represents the grounds of hope for others. That we can develop a society in which we can rationally assess people, figure out who are the most efficient people, who are the best people, reward them, and organize political and economic and social life on the basis of merit, on the basis of pure reason. Early movements in Enlightenment thought, rationalism and empiricism. I'm actually not going to get too much into that now. You should know, so rationalism, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, the rationalists are going to say we should come to ethical, political, philosophical truths on the basis of pure reason alone, independently of tradition, independently of theology. So earlier, philosophy was understood as a discipline that was the handmaiden to theology. If you don't know, in the Middle Ages, you have a ranking of all the different sciences, and the highest possible science was the science of theology. So the most intelligent and brightest people went and studied theology. And theology was understood as the queen of the sciences precisely because it's the most certain form of knowledge. And it's also about the highest subject. Physics is just about rocks. That's stupid. Like, a rock is not that interesting. It's not that complicated. Whereas for a medieval, something like biology, even though they didn't use the word, would be more interesting because animals are animated. They move. They can do sorts of different things. They have impulses. They're more complicated. And the most complicated subject of all to study would be God, because there's nothing more complicated than God. God is infinitely complex, infinitely good, infinitely beautiful, infinitely merciful. Whatever you want to say about God, it's infinite. And so theology, therefore, has to be the queen of the sciences because it's studying the most complicated thing. What are the rationalists going to do? They're going to say we have to do away with theology, do away with revelation, and just operate on the basis of pure reason. But pure reason in the mathematical sense. So particularly for Descartes and Leibniz, and you see it in Spinoza as well, they write everything out like syllogisms. Everything is incredibly mathematical, and everything is, here's a philosophy term, a priori. It's done independently of experience. So they're trying to come to rational truths that don't have anything to do with experience. This is actually where René Descartes' famous "I think, therefore I am" comes from. Because René Descartes, in his meditations, he has a passage where he's like, what if he's at his fireside, and he's thinking, well, what if I'm dreaming right now? What if a demon is deluding me? What if, like, all my sense perceptions are actually incorrect? Like, you could imagine, right? What if I think I'm recording this video, but I'm actually high on some sort of hallucinogenic substance, and this is just an illusion? Or what if I'm dreaming right now and I'm not recording the video? Or what if I'm recording this video, but it's actually a demon trying to convince me that I'm recording a video? So Descartes puts into question all sense perception, and he says, well, the one thing we can count on is the fact that we are thinking, and that our thinking is tied to our existence, that we can't deny the fact that we are having this sort of existential experience. I don't really like the rationalists. I think most of it's stupid. I think Descartes is sort of the beginning of the end of Western philosophy in a lot of ways. But that's the rationalist move. You can see how this is proto-enlightenment. Later, you're going to have the empiricists, Locke and Hume. We're going to talk a lot about Locke later. I'll get to him. And then Hume we'll talk about in transcendentalism. But they basically say, no, actually we can't come to apodictic certainty about anything. All of the truths that we come to know are a posteriori, and they're not, meaning they're from experience, and they're all on the basis of probabilities, right? So it's something like every crow I've ever seen is black, therefore there's a very high chance that the next crow I see is black. But it's not certain, right? Because maybe the next crow I see is white. That's always a possibility. And for someone like Hume, we actually never achieve certainty about anything. We achieve higher and higher degrees of probability. Science is a wonderful thing because it helps us, or it enables us to achieve higher and higher degrees of probability, but we can never be certain about anything. But you can see both of these worldviews are discarding revelation and theology. They're taking revelation and theology out of the picture. I don't want to get too much into that, though if you do have questions, please post them down below. We're going to finish out today by talking about the 7 characteristics of the Enlightenment. And as I mentioned, this is the equivalent of what tulip is to the Puritans. You want to memorize these. You want to make sure you know these like the back of your hand. We'll talk a lot more about these when we get to the Enlightenment vocab. I'll have a PowerPoint for that. In any case, the first one of these is the natural goodness of human beings. So we move away from the idea that human beings are born innately sinful. Instead, we say, hey, no, human beings are actually born innately good. Our minds are not fallen, right? Because the Puritans believe reason is fallen. As a result, like all of man's faculties fall with him. This is the idea. All of man's faculties fall with him at the time that Adam and Eve eat of the fruit. And so even our reason is flawed. And the Puritans say, your reason cannot save you. Well, if we get rid of the idea of the fall, because we've thrown out revelation, we've thrown out theology as a source of information about the world, and we say, let's just look at things rationally, well, maybe we believe that actually human beings are inclined to be innately good. And so if human beings are inclined to be innately good, and number three, the caveat, human beings are also rational, and we can rely on our rational thoughts because we know we're not being deluded by demons. We know that our reason is not suffering from the consequences of the fall. And if reason is all we don't have a higher faculty like faith or revelation, well then lo and behold, human beings can become perfect. And you'll see this in Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin, in the second part of the autobiography, actually goes on a quest to try to become a perfect human being. He says, I am going through my own effort, through reason, through scientific application, I am going to become a perfect human being. And so this is part of the Enlightenment idea that, like, think back to Whig historiography. Things are just going to get better and better and better and better, rather than, as Christians would say, worse and worse and worse, or as pagans would say, things will just move in an eternal cycle of good and bad. No, no, no. Enlightenment thinkers are going to say, no, we can actually become perfect. Every generation can become better than the last. How American is that? Every generation is going to make more money. Hasn't happened in 80 years. But in any case, every generation is going to do better than the last. We'll make more money. We'll be smarter. Right? The Flynn effect, you can look into that, all sorts of nonsense. And we're just going to get better and better and better and better because we can apply reason. We'll run more and more experiments. We'll acquire more and more knowledge. And because we're inclined to good, there's no way this can possibly falter. Fourth view you'll see is deism. So deism is the belief that there is a God, but God does not reveal himself in human history, and nor does God interact with human history. So if you notice, in like all the major religions, Hinduism through the avatars, Christianity through the incarnation of Christ, Islam through the revelation to the Prophet Muhammad, right? You look at all these different religions, they are predicated on God intervening in human history. Deism says God has never intervened in human history. In fact, God does not care about you. God is this sort of abstract force that does what? He's the divine watchmaker. If the universe is a watch, he winds it up and he lets it go. He sets it in motion. Or think about it like a top. He takes the top, he spins the top, he flicks it, and the universe is in motion. What is the setting of the watch or the flicking of the top? It's essentially writing all the laws. So he's like a computer programmer is the way we think about it now. He programs the physics. He programs all the mathematical truths. He put in motion that the interior angles of a triangle are going to add up to 180. He invented calculus. He did all the different things. And so he sets everything up, he flicks the top, and he lets it go. That's deism. And so a deist would say prayer doesn't do anything because God doesn't listen to you, God doesn't care about you, God has no sort of human personality. God does not intervene in human history. He just set the laws and physics in motion. Well then, if I'm a deist, how do I come to know God? Because if I'm a Catholic, the way I know God is through prayer, is through revelation, studying the scriptures, is through studying the church, is through listening to my priest, is through the frequenting of the sacraments, so on and so forth. If I'm a Muslim, it's through my 5 daily prayers, it's through the listening or reading of the Quran, it's through the study of the Hadith, right? I could go all these different avenues to try to get this privileged form of knowledge that, again, is higher than natural knowledge. But for a deist, there is no revelation. So to know physics, to study the natural laws of the universe, to study science and math, is to know the mind of God. So you can see deism is actually a tremendous spur for the subsequent scientific revolution, is that, well, if I can't understand God by way of revelation, theology is no more the queen of the sciences. Now, actually, physics and math become the queen of the sciences. The way we still consider physics and math the queen of the sciences today, right? That's a legacy from the Enlightenment. You study math in college and you're good at it, you're going to have, $150,000 a year job starting salary. Same with physics. Everybody knows those are the most prestigious. Biology, English, philosophy, they're not as prestigious. And theology, come on, if you study theology, you're going to be even more bankrupt than the English major, right? So queen of the sciences no more. Deism says you want to know the mind of God, study the laws of the universe that he created. Next, equality before the law and right to individual liberty. Well, where does this idea come from? There are no more privileged classes of people. Because think about it. In the medieval worldview, where does the idea of a privileged class of people come from? The aristocracy, the monarchy, the clergy. It comes from revelation, right? Hopefully you're getting this. All of those ideas are predicated upon revelation. If you get rid of the centrality of the gospel, of the church, of canon law, of the magisterium, of the church fathers, of the sacred traditions, like if you throw all those things out, well then why would you treat a priest differently from the rest of human beings? Why does the king have the right to rule over you? Why does the aristocracy have the right to collect taxes? All of those things no longer make sense. Why is there serfdom that lives in a basic state of slavery? None of those things make sense anymore if you're operating on the basis of pure reason and you no longer believe in revelation. And so the idea is, well, we should arrange social institutions rationally. And so in the Christian worldview, if you're born a noble, that's not fair or unfair. That was God's decision, and who are you to contradict God? God's infinitely more intelligent than you. So if I don't like my noble, I go, well, I don't like him. He seems like a bad guy, but God will judge him in the next life. My job in this life is duty, is to obey him and to be the best peasant I possibly can be. And I'm not looking for a reward in this life. I'm looking for a reward in the next life. Well, in the Enlightenment, the idea is, hey, why does this guy get to command? Maybe he's incompetent. Maybe he's a drunkard. He should not have the right to step on other people just on the basis of his birth. So we're going to basically say we're going to have a society where there's a high degree of social mobility and everybody has equality of opportunity. We all start out in the same place and we all have the same rights. Because believe it or not, in the Middle Ages and even through the early modern period, like clergy operated on a different set of laws than like regular people. They had different rights. So for example, if a clergyman was convicted of something that would have him normally be the death penalty, he had in England what was called benefit of clergy, whereby if he could read a prayer in Latin and prove that he was clergy, he could not be executed. Another fine or penalty could be imposed, but clergy could not be executed for any reason. Well, why? Because they were considered a separate class of people as a result of revelation. That is done away with in the Enlightenment. Religious tolerance, the whole idea here of tolerance being we're all part of a universal brotherhood of man, and religion has no place in the public sphere, which that's a new idea. In all systems prior to the 17th century, maybe 18th century in some cases, every single government is confessional, meaning it confesses a particular faith and it bases all of its political decisions on the revelation of that religion. So Islam, you can't separate the politics of Islamic governments from the religion. All of the Christian princedoms, in Russia, the Tsar, there is a clear relationship between church and state that is syncretic in all of those, institutions. Hinduism, the caste system, in all of the world prior to the Enlightenment, there is no idea of religious tolerance. It may be that you allow people of, for example, in Spain, it may be that you allow Muslims within your realm, but the idea is they're not going to have the same rights as Christians, and also they cannot preach Islam because that would damage both the spiritual and political integrity of the nation, of the given people. Well, in the Enlightenment, it says, hey, look, we're not making political decisions on the basis of religion anyway. All of our political decisions are on the basis of pure reason. So as long as if you can set your religion aside when we get down to the business of politics, I can be tolerant of your religion. Which is the sort of détente that America has reached to this day, which is you can believe whatever you want in the privacy of your house as long as you don't bring it into the public sphere and we make all of our public decisions on the basis of pure reason. You can be Jewish and I'll be tolerant of you. You can be Muslim and I'll be tolerant of you. You'll be tolerant of me. And we'll all get along because none of us are bringing our religious beliefs into the public sphere. The problem with this is that every religion has a public aspect. Every religion has a political philosophy built into it because a religion is a complete and totalizing system of thought. So this doesn't really work in practice, but it's part of the reason why, again, America becomes an a-confessional state and does not have a national church. Though there is an attempt in the 19th century to establish the Presbyterian Church as the national church. And then universal brotherhood of all human beings follows from that. Okay? Hopefully I have clarified these terms and given you a pretty strong introduction to the idea of enlightenment that'll help you understand when we look at Ben Franklin, when we look at Jefferson, when we look at Philip Freneau, and all the other writers of the American Enlightenment. Next time, probably a couple days from now, we'll go over the second side of the sheet, talk a little bit about genre, talk a little bit about the literature of the Enlightenment, but we're going to close it out for today. If you enjoyed, please give a like and a subscribe. It really helps out the channel a lot. Take a look in the description at those two programs, the College Degree Accelerator if you want to graduate at 19 like I did, or the Scholar's Path if you're interested in learning how to be an intellectual. What are the habits of intellectuals? What things should you be doing? Those are both great programs that I have. Take care, guys. I hope you're having a great 4th of July, and I will see you all around.